Okay, good evening. I want to welcome everyone back here tonight to our study on 1 Samuel. And tonight we will be looking at chapters 7 and 8. And let's go ahead and begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commands and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, and I want to welcome. We got some folks that I haven't seen in a long time there, and glad to have you back with us. Then, all right. So tonight we're going to be looking at picking up after the ark. The last couple of weeks, we've talked about how that the ark was captured, and then it went through all sorts of cities within the Philistine territory, and how that God afflicted each one of them with a some kind of a disease. Now we don't really know what it was, but some say it was a bubonic plague, and there's some pretty good evidence for that. But each of the cities that hosted the ark, they were afflicted with this, and eventually the Philistines said, "Well, we've had enough. We give up. We're going to send the ark back to Israel, and maybe we won't have to suffer through this plague any longer." But at the same time, what this did was the victory that the Philistines had over Israel at Aphek or Ebenezer, it had some effects. The Philistine territory was expanded a great deal, and they took over a lot more of the Israel's territory, and of course Israel's morale was totally devastated by the loss of the ark, and the tabernacle was destroyed. The Philistines just went right on over. They from Aphek there to Ebenezer, which was just right there across the mountain. And then they just kept on going. They just followed up the Israeli troops and went to Shiloh and destroyed the tabernacle. The tabernacle had been there for like 430 years, housing the Ark of the Covenant, and had been the center of Israelite worship, because they had not yet moved to Jerusalem, because the Jebusites still controlled Jerusalem, and it would not be captured until David later on, 100 years or so later. So, or maybe not 100 years, but sometime later during the reign of David, he came and he captured Jerusalem, turned it into Jerusalem instead of Jebus. And so as a result of all of this stuff, Israel turned away from God, and they just fell into that same old pattern that they had been in the all throughout the book of Judges, where they would be on top. They would be worshiping God. They would be doing the commandments and everything, and then they would start going away from it a little bit, and then they'd fall into just abject sin. And so God would send somebody there to chastise them, to remind them of, hey, what are you guys doing? And then they would be oppressed for a while, and then they would from there they would cry out to God. God would hear their cries, send a judge to a military leader, essentially, to relieve them of their oppression and lead them back to worship of the one true God, and then they would start the cycle over again. And so here, that's basically where we find them here with with this, and so that's kind of where we ended up. Remember that the ark had been captured. They gave it to the people at Beth Shemesh, and they didn't treat the ark properly. They wanted to look inside, and hey, let's see what's inside there. And that 70 men died from mishandling the ark and not giving the ark the proper reverence that it should have had, but with maybe non-Levites handling the ark. And so at that point, then they sent it on up to another town, and so that's where we left it last week, and that's where we are today. Then with this lesson. All right. So, are there any questions or comments so far about what we had seen last week with the ark and that some of the things that were going on there? Any comments or questions as to where we're going with all of this? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll read through it, because I know some of you are on phones and you're not following. And plus, I'm not posting the scriptures any longer on there because it don't need to, and we're just trying a little bit different way of doing it here. And so 1 Samuel 7, 3 through 4, that's where we're picking up tonight. Then Samuel spoke to the whole house of Israel, saying, if you are returning to Adonai with all your heart, then remove the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and direct your hearts to Adonai, and serve him only. Then he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So Bnei Israel removed the Baalim and the Ashtaroth, and served Adonai alone. So all throughout Israel, there had been these what they call high places, and they typically would erect some kind of a pillar, kind of like maybe a I keep thinking of the Washington Monument, an obelisk, or something like that. But generally speaking, they would have some kind of a long, skinny pole that would be up on the high point of Israel, so that people could look up, and in the surrounding area they could look up on the hill over there, and it said, "Oh yeah, okay, I see the Ashtoreth pole or whatever," and that's where they worshipped. That was typical Canaanite way of worshiping. And so here are some pictures of those two that are specifically mentioned here in verses 3 and 4. The Ashtaroth, she was a fertility goddess, and then the Baal, which in a way he was a kind of a compilation of all of the gods. In fact, here it says, remove the Baalim. That's plural, and so it says remove all of these places where Baal is worshipped, and Ashtaroth, same kind of a thing. Just you have to get rid of all of those. So evidently, what we're seeing here is that Israel was being oppressed a lot by the Philistines, and they're starting to complain about it, and so they go to Samuel and say, "Hey, can we do something?" And said, "Okay, if you would return to the Lord with all your heart, get rid of all of these things, then he will deliver you from the hands of the Philistines." So that's what they did. Then they gathered together in Mizpah. Now, where was Mizpah? Okay, we've been talking about here. All right, here is this little space down here, just so that you know. This is Jerusalem, Yebus, okay? Yeah, that is Jerusalem. And then Mizpah is 10, 12 miles up here, up the road, in this spot here. Now, they gathered there drew water and poured it out before Adonai. They fasted on that day and said there, we have sinned against Adonai. Then Samuel was judging Bnei Israel at Mizpah. And we find out later on that he made a circuit from the various cities up in that area, and he stayed at Mizpah for a while, and he was a circuit riding judge, as I guess you would say. And so he said he was judging Bnei Israel at Mizpah at that time. That's where he was in his stop, in his annual cycle and circle of judging. Now, when the Philistines heard that Bnei Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines marched against Israel. When Bnei Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. So Bnei Israel said to Samuel, don't stop crying out to Adonai our God for us, so he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. All right, so basically what we've got here is that these guys go to Mizpah, and they get together with Samuel and say, look, we would really like to be delivered from the Philistines. And he says, okay, get rid of all of your idols, which they did. And so they're gathered here to offer up a sacrifice to the Lord. And sometimes, in the land of Israel, what was really the most precious commodity that they had? Well, that would have been water. I mean, water is that's the most precious thing that they could have, because sometimes they didn't have it. And actually, indeed, water is one of the most important things that we have today, even. And actually, wars have been fought over them, and water is extremely important. Because why? Because that's what we make coffee out of every morning. All right, so they poured out some water as an offering, something expensive to them. Water was in short supply, so they poured out some of it to Adonai, symbolically saying, "Okay, here is a sacrifice to you." And we'd think, well, just water. No, it was something significant to them. And so then the Philistines heard that they were gathered there. There must have been a pretty good gathering of Israelites there, because the Philistines said, "Oh, well, okay, let's go and get them." And so they marched up against the Israelite people. And when they saw that all the Philistines coming, they were afraid. Well, with good reason too. The Philistines were very well known for their warlike qualities and their ruthlessness, and they were just bad dudes. So they then tell Samuel, "Hey, do not quit crying out to the Lord, because we know that that's where our help comes from. We're not going to be able to do this on our own." And so, they got that part right. Of all of the things that a lot of times they don't get right, they got that part right. And so Samuel, he took a nursing lamb. He offered it as a whole offering to Adonai, a whole burnt offering, the olah. Then Samuel cried out to Adonai for Israel, and Adonai answered him. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel, but Adonai thundered with a loud thunder on that day against the Philistines and confused them, so that they were defeated before Israel. Then the men of Israel went out to Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down all the way to Beth-kar. All right. When you think about this, these Philistines came to Mizpah against Israel, and it said that God he thundered against them. The very idea, in some ways, is kind of comical, but in another way, it could be very frightening to the people. Because have you ever been in a storm where the thunder was so strong and so loud that it like shook the walls or it shook the ground? uh, because the lightning, of course, was very, very close. And that very, very scary thing. It can be very scary. And so here they are in that situation, and that God just thunders against them, um, and it just throws them in kind of a panic. I can imagine that possibly there was with all of this thunder, there had to have been some lightning perhaps. And of course, God could make his own thunder without lightning, I guess. But it threw them all into a confusion. Maybe their iron chariots, that they had come against Israel with before, wouldn't, their horses got scared and ran off into each other, and so forth. Whatever, however it happened, they they were just totally confused. Their battle array broke down, and once that broke down, because back in those days they would come together with their soldiers in a formation, and they had the shields and this and that and the other, and so um, it gave them a modicum of defense against spears, javelins, arrows, the swordsman, whatever. But then once God confused them and they got to, discombobulated somehow there, Israel was able to come through and break through their defenses and defeated them. And so it said they struck them down all the way to Beth Kar, which is a long way. I don't think I have a map that shows Beth Kar in here. But this is where they were. This was here they were at Mizpah, and this is a picture of the Philistine cities and territory. They had really come out over here into this Central Valley area and taken a lot of the Israelite land. Normally, they were pretty well restricted to just right along this coast over here, and they didn't venture out too much from that. But they ended up the Philistines kept expanding and expanding, especially after their victory up here at Aphek, and then they went over here and destroyed destroyed Shiloh and so forth. So now they have been they've been destroyed. They are they've been defeated, and so now the Samuel he put a stone up here. It says between Mizpah, which is right. I think it's right here, and Seth. So I don't know where Seth was. It's not on here, but put up a stone there, and it just says, and it's for Ebenezer, and it says that thus far to this point now God has helped us. So the Philistines, they were subdued, and they did not invade the border of Israel anymore. The hand of Adonai was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The towns that the Philistines had taken from Israel, from Ekron to Gath. Here is Gath. Here's Ekron, and they were restored to Israel. Basically, the borders of the Philistines shrunk back to where they were, and today the descendants of the Philistines actually are right down here in Gaza. They have that little strip of land, and they are the descendants of the ancient Philistines, possibly. Okay, I'm not one of those kind of, what do you call, I don't know, anthropologists or something, but I read a lot of stuff, and that's one of the theories that in today's Israel, the so-called Palestinians, which there's not really a Palestinian people as such, that the ones from down in Gaza Strip, they were descendants of the Philistines, and the others are descendants of the Jebusites, the people that lived around um, Jerusalem, and right across into Jordan. And we know that a lot of the Palestinian so-called people today are basically they're Jordanians. That they were Jordanian troublemakers, and that the King Hassan there in Jordan, he didn't want them there. So the older king, the one that was assassinated, so they just pushed him out of Jordan and said over into Israel. Good riddance, that sort of thing. All right, that we got away from that. That was a rabbi trail. All right, so it says then that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He used to go annually on a circuit, and here's the the ruins that tell at Mizpah. You can't really tell too much about it, but they know where it's at. That's where it is. Okay, so Samuel would go on it said he used to go annually on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and would judge over Israel in all those places. Then he would return to Ramah because his home was there, and from there he would judge Israel. So he actually built an altar to Adonai there in Ramah. And so I just took with my feeble little art skills and my software that I have, and kind of drew a line here of the various places. Here's Gilgal right here, and he would go there to Mizpah and Ramah and Bethel, and so that was his circuit, and he was actually up in Mizpah when the Israelites came to him and says, "Hey, can we do something here about these Philistines? Would you go to the Lord for us?" All right, so let's see. Any comments or questions so far on anything that we've got that I've run across? I know I'm hitting this stuff kind of on a high level because tonight what we will do is we will finish off the period of the judges over Israel, and then we will begin next week with the period of the kings, the monarchy in Israel. So that's where we're going to finish off tonight. So I wanted to really get this done tonight. Any comments or questions so far? All right. So now we find ourselves in chapter 8. Now, there's a lot of controversy among the Bible scholars and all of those the PhD deities as they discuss things with themselves regarding where this chapter would fit in the whole scheme of things. And it's, to me, just looking at it, I don't know, I'm not any kind of a highly educated guy and so forth, but it just looks to me like that this period, this chapter 8, is kind of a transition period, and it transitions. It kind of closes out the life of Samuel, and then it starts talking about the kingship of the selection and so forth of a king and King Saul. So it kind of fits nicely right in there, and so I can't really make an argument one way or the other as to where it should be, other than, yeah, it looks good to me. So but that's what it looks like, that where that one would fit. Now, what happened here, I'm going to go ahead and read Samuel, 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 9. It says, "Now when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the second one was Abijah, or Yoel and Abiyah. They were judges in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain." Does that bring to mind anyone? Yeah, Eli's sons, that they did the same thing. It was very, very lucrative to be a so-called government official. It's kind of like there's nothing new under the sun. Okay, so here's some guys that they're not particularly wealthy when they come into the leadership roles as a judge in Israel, and it's not very, very long until here they are. They're wealthy, and we see that in our own government all the time. That how can a person that makes $175,000 a year after a few years be worth about $20 million? I don't know. That's pretty good. That pretty good savings account, if you ask me. But we know it's all crooked, and that's just what happens in the swamp. So going ahead, before I get into political trouble here, it says, his sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but had turned aside after dishonest gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah, where he lived, and said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the matter was displeasing in Samuel's eyes when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to Adonai. Then Adonai said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, rather they have rejected me from being king over them, like all the deeds that they have done since the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you also. So now listen to their voice. However, you must earnestly forewarn them and declare to them the rulings of the king who will reign over them." Okay, so this is toward the end of the judgeship of Samuel, and he does something different that that we didn't see before. That he actually appointed his sons as judges. Now, we had the high priest Eli, however you want to pronounce that. He had his two sons, but they were hereditary in that they were Levites, they were Kohens, and so that was a hereditary succession that God had set up. But not so with the judges. The judges were appointed by God, and the judges were not then supposed to appoint their sons to follow on behind them. Possibly Samuel did this because he saw that he was getting old and there was no one else, and so here he was up in the north. He sent the two sons down to Beersheba, which was at that point was pretty much the physical limit, southern limit of Israel at the time. And practically speaking, because you go down south of Beersheba, it's nothing but there's nothing down there except just desert. It's the Negev, and it's really, really inhospitable, and so people didn't live there very much, and so that's where he sent them down there to the very southern border of Israel, and they were crooked. There's no other way to say it. They were just flat crooked. So uh, the people, the elders of Israel, then got together with him and said, and possibly, Israel had like 70 elders. Traditionally, they had 70 men that kind of ruled over, or maybe not ruled over, but administered things in Israel along with the judge. And so they approached Samuel about, let's have a king, because you're getting old. Your two sons, they're no good, and they're not doing any of us a favor. And so we want to have a king just like all the other nations, just like everybody else, Egypt and Assyria and the Moabites and the Amorites and the whoever, all the other ites that were out there. Uh, they had kings, so why can't we have a king? And Samuel was not happy with that. He knew that God did not want Israel to have a king, that was not the way that he set things up. But, so he's looking at this and saying, in his own mind, God knew his mind here. Because when he prayed to Adonai, God said, listen to these voices. Listen to what they're saying, okay? Just listen to it. He says, they're not rejecting you, because that's what was in Samuel's mind, that they had rejected him as in his leadership. But God said, no, they have not rejected you. They have rejected me. And they've done this ever since I brought them out of Egypt. It's been worse than herding cats now for 1,000 years. Well, not 1,000 years. It'd be from 1446 to this time here would about 1000. So it's 400-600 years, something like that. But for that whole time, what was it? It was a cycle of rebellion the whole time. And God said, look, this is nothing new. They've been doing this to me for 500 or 600 years now. So they're not rejecting you. They're in their old pattern. They're rejecting me over again. And so he's just listened to them. I'm going to do it. We're going to give them a king. But you got to warn them that this is what happens when you get a king. This is what's going to come to the fore if you have a king, and these are the things that you must be aware of. They'd never lived under a king, only under oppressions and so on and so forth. So so God has given into it, and so Samuel reported, says in 8 verse 10 says, now Samuel reported all the words of Adonai to the people who were asking him for a king. This will be the practice of the king that will reign over you. He will draft your sons and assign them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint them as commanders of thousands and captains of 50s, also some to plow his fields, reap his harvest, make his weapons of war and the equipment for his chariots. Also, he will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize the best of your fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials and slaves. He will also take your male and female servants, your best young men, and your donkeys, and make them do his work. He will also take 1/10 of your flocks. Then you yourselves will become his slaves. But when the day comes, you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself. Adonai will not answer you on that day. Okay, this is kind of bleak here, that God is telling here the idea of a monarchy and this basically big government is going to have a problem. You're going to have big problems. Then says, okay, your sons will be drafted into the army, basically, and before when Israel would go to war, they would gather up and they would basically say, okay, any of you guys that are afraid and you don't really want to go to war, then okay, go home, because we don't want you. We don't want you infecting our army with um, your fears and so forth. So, um, but now God is telling them, look, this is what's going to happen. The king is going to draft anybody and everybody, whether you want to go to war or not, whether you're afraid or not. He's going to draft you and use you. You're going to be used. You're going to be abused. And he said, he's going to put them in the army, and they're going to be commanders and so on and so forth. But then there's others that he's going to take and draft you into his agriculture and his infrastructure. That they're going to plow the fields or reap or whatever, or you're going to be in the manufacture of weapons and the equipment for chariots, just all sorts of things that if you have a king and therefore a standing army, then you're going to have full-time soldiers. And God is saying, okay, just be aware, this is what's going to happen to you. And then he's going to take your daughters, and they're going to be have to do certain things, and he's going to seize the best of your land. This is the part that really chafes me. Says he will seize the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his cronies back up in Washington. I mean, in wherever they are. Basically, that's what it's going to be. He's going to seize your property and give it to his buds that are in his court. Is basically what they're saying there. And says he's going to take your people, your assets, your male and female servants, your best men, your employees, your best people. These kings are going to do that. That's what they're going to do. And he's going to tithe you. He's going to take a tenth of all of your stock of your flocks, and in fact, you yourselves will become slaves, his slaves. And so we kind of look at that and say, well, now, isn't that a little bit harsh? But look at it today. Okay, so we don't particularly have a king, but we have a form of government that does the same things to us. Okay, right now we don't have a draft, but you can bet your bottom dollar that if we got into another war, that somebody decided that, oh, we might lose this thing if we don't get some more people in there, they will start the draft again in a pair of New York seconds. In fact, I guess the young men, when they reach the age of 18, they still have to register for the draft. And so that's going to happen again. It's only a matter of time that before that happens. And the whole idea of taking our lands. My goodness, I've complained many times. Many of you I see on the list here. You live in Texas, and in Texas we never ever actually own our own property. My little place out here has been paid off for quite a few years, and I have no mortgage. But at the same time, just wait. If I missed that tax payment that rolls around every year, they'd send the sheriff out here and take my property. It's not mine because it actually belongs to the government. And that's what God is warning Israel about here, is that's what happens when you have a king. When you had just judges, it was kind of a loose assortment, kind of laissez-faire government and so forth. You didn't have that sort of thing. Now, and so he's going to take your best. Basically, these guys are going to take the best of everything. And it also says he's going to take a tenth of your flocks. You know, man, I would be ecstatic if all of the taxing authority was only 10%. But as many of you know, our taxes today, when you get right down to it, all the state, federal, local, and all of that kind of stuff, it's almost 50% of your paycheck goes to taxes of one sort or another. And so, but these guys, he says, he'll take a tenth of your flocks. Well, guess what? They've really outdone themselves by the here 2,500 years later. Our politicians could look at their politicians and say they were just a bunch of pikers, because our guys are even more adept at stealing us blind. So, but God says, now look, when this happens, it's going to happen. And when it does, all right, guys, I am not going to listen. I'm not going to answer you on that. You made your bed, you're going to lie in it, is basically what he said. So, but the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they don't. No, we want a king. We want a king, and we want to be like the other nations. So here they are. They're a chosen people, and they said, "Well, no, we don't. We want to give up that chosen status. We want to be like everybody else and have a king just like everyone else." That just shows that they are rejecting God over and over again. Had they listened to God, obeyed his commandments, followed Torah, God would have taken care of them. They would not have had to fight these battles, because guess what? God is capable of fighting the battles, and he can go out there and thunder and destroy a nation, or just said, I think it's going to be a little bit of rain and hail, and it just, he killed armies that way. In fact, at one point in Judges, it said that God killed more with hail than he did than the Israelites were able to do with swords. So, but here again, God, these people, they just didn't listen to Samuel at all. They said, no, we want a king. We want to be like other nations. We want to have this guy standing out there in the front to fight our battles. And so, after Samuel heard all the words of the people, he reported them back in the hearing of Adonai. Of course, God had already heard it anyway. And but God said to Samuel, he said, okay, listen to their voice and appoint a king to reign over them. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, go home, go each one to his town. Here, normally when it says that the men of Israel, they're talking about an army. But in this particular case, I believe it's talking about the 70 elders that had come to Samuel to petition for a king. And so now he's just telling them, okay, you guys go home. And it kind of sets everything up in tension. This is one of those cliffhangers, so that we know next week we're going to get into, this is the end of the judgeship of God and over Israel, and setting judges and God's direct. It's the end of a theocracy, and it becomes the beginning of a monarchy. Certainly not a democracy. It was a monarchy, and it was many, 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 many years before they ever had a democracy. I think like 1948. So that is, and it was actually, this was all prophesied by Moses. Look in the last few chapters of Deuteronomy, where he's telling the people goodbye, and he says, okay, and then one of these days you are going to have a king, and all this stuff's going to happen to you, and you're going to turn your back on God, and God's going to punish you, and all that. That was all prophesied. Moses was a prophet, and so sure enough, this is about 1000 A.D. right here when Moses was giving his prophecy. It was about 1400 A.D. Because they came out of Israel in 1446 BCE. I mean, 1446 BC, and then of course 40 years in the desert, so that brings it right up there close to 1400 BCE. And so here from 1400 BCE to 1000 BCE, 600 years or 400 years. That I always have a hard time counting backwards in the BCE era. Here during this time now, Moses said, this is what's going to happen to you. And sure enough, 400 years later, it's happening. All right. So now, are there any comments or questions that anyone might happen to have regarding this lesson tonight? And again,